The form letter came back on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a plastic bag stapled to a manila envelope, the way official things arrived when they wanted to look serious without actually being serious. Dorothy Callahan was standing on her porch with her first cup of coffee when the mail truck came by, and she set the cup on the railing and took the envelope and read the cover sheet right there in the October light, while a cold wind moved through the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. Preliminary inquiry. No action required at this time. Pending follow-up Monday. She already knew what was inside. She had taken the photographs herself. Dorothy opened the envelope and looked at the 7 images she had printed from her phone and placed in sequence. A child named Amy Voss, 8-year-old daughter of the woman who had lived next door until 14 months ago. The child stood in the examination room of the Harlow Urgent Care Clinic where Dorothy volunteered 2 days a week. She stood the way children stood when they had learned that stillness was safer than flinching. The burns were mapped across her ribs and shoulder blades in clusters, small, perfect circles, the diameter of a standard cigarette. Dorothy had been a registered nurse for 31 years before she retired. She knew the difference between accidental burns and deliberate ones. She knew the pattern of a child used as an ashtray by someone who felt entitled to use whatever was near them. She put the photographs back in the envelope. She picked up her coffee. She stood on the porch and looked at the house next door, quiet in the early morning, Clifford Voss's truck sitting in the driveway at an angle that suggested he had come home late and parked without caring about straight lines. She had filed the report 4 days ago. She had driven to the county sheriff's office herself and handed the folder to a deputy named Garrett, who looked at her the way young men sometimes looked at old women who were occupying their time with inconvenient truths. She had given him her name and address and volunteer credentials and 31 years of nursing experience as context for the photographs and what they showed. He had thanked her. He had told her someone would be in touch. Yesterday, she had watched Deputy Marcus Boone drive Clifford Voss home from the county jail. Voss had posted bail in under 5 hours. The charge had already been reduced from felony child abuse to misdemeanor negligence, pending further review. Marcus had clapped Voss on the shoulder outside the jail and laughed at something Dorothy could not hear. She had watched this through her front window because she had been watching, because she had known this was the kind of thing that happened when the system and the man who needed protecting from it were connected by decades of shared history and mutual convenience. And now the photographs had come back in a plastic bag. No action required at this time. Dorothy went inside. She made a fresh cup and sat at the kitchen table where Raymond had always sat across from her with the newspaper. Raymond had been dead 8 years. She still set 2 cups out of habit, and she had stopped apologizing to herself for it because Raymond would have found the apology unnecessary. She sat and thought about a box in the bedroom closet she had not opened since the week after his funeral. She had gone through it once just to feel close to him and had put it away because grief had a limit she respected. But she was thinking about it now because there was a phone number in that box. Raymond had made her memorize it 15 years ago and write it in 3 separate places, and he had told her with the specific gravity of a man who chose his words before he spent them, that if she was ever in serious trouble and he was not there to help, she should call that number. She had asked who the number belonged to. He had said, a friend. She had asked what kind of friend. He had said, the kind that shows up. Dorothy finished her coffee, washed and dried the cup, and put it back in the cabinet next to the one she had set out and not used. Then she went to the closet and lifted the box down from the shelf. The number was on a folded index card in the back of Raymond's old leather address book, the ink faded but legible. No name, just the number, and below it, in Raymond's careful hand, for when everything else has failed, call this. They will come. She stood in the hallway for a long moment with the card in her fingers. Then she took it to the kitchen table and sat down and dialed. It rang 4 times. She was composing what she would say to a voicemail when a man answered. His voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who had been awake too long, or who had learned to answer phones in places where phones rang at hours that meant something was wrong. "Yes," he said. "My name is Dorothy Callahan," she said. "I was married to Raymond Callahan. He gave me this number a long time ago and told me to call it if everything else had failed. I believe that is where I am." A pause. Not long. Then the voice changed, not softer exactly, but more present, the quality of attention increasing. "Mrs. Callahan, how long has Raymond been gone?" 8 years. "I'm sorry for that. He was a good man. What's happening?" Dorothy told him. She moved through the facts in the organized, sequential way she had learned over 31 years of medical reporting, because emotion clouded transmission, and she needed him to receive this clearly. She told him about Amy Voss, about the burns she had documented, about the photographs now sitting in an envelope in her hand. She told him about Clifford Voss posting bail in 5 hours, about Marcus Boone driving him home from the county jail with a laugh and a shoulder clap, about the form letter with its bureaucratic abdication of responsibility. When she finished, the man was quiet for a moment. "Where is the child now?" he asked. "At school. She doesn't know what I've been doing. She comes to my house in the afternoons. I've been feeding her dinner because Clifford Voss doesn't cook anything that isn't from a can." "Does Voss know you filed the report?" "He knows someone did. He came to my door the morning after he got home. He didn't say anything threatening directly. He stood on my porch and asked if I had any mail for him because sometimes the postal carrier mixed up their addresses. I said no. He nodded and left. But the looking lasted too long and meant something I recognized." "What did it mean?" "I've been a nurse long enough to know what it looks like when a man is deciding whether you are a problem that needs solving." A pause. Then Mrs. Callahan, "Do you still live at the address on Sycamore Road?" The pale yellow house with the cottonwood out front, a small chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "How do you know that?" "Raymond sent me a Christmas card every year until he couldn't anymore," the man said. "I kept the address." She sat with this for a moment. The image of Raymond, methodical and faithful, sending Christmas cards across decades to a number with no name. "What do I call you?" she asked. "Graves," he said. "Just Graves. Mrs. Callahan, I want you to go inside and lock your doors and leave a light on in the kitchen. We'll be there before morning." "We," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "How many?" she asked. Because she was a practical woman, he told her, 78. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll need more than 1 pot of coffee." "Make 3, he said. Then the line went quiet. She set the phone on the table, looked at the index card, looked at the pale October sky through the kitchen window. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it could hear but not see. She got up and started counting coffee cans. The sound arrived at 2:20 in the morning, felt before heard, a vibration she registered in her sternum while she was sitting at the kitchen table with a mystery novel open in front of her that she had not read a single page of in the past 90 minutes. She went to the front window and looked out. They came down Sycamore Road in a line that seemed to have no end. Headlights cutting through the dark in pairs, then more pairs, the low rolling thunder of engines at a register that moved up through the ground, and the porch boards, and into her feet. She counted as they arrived and stopped counting at 50 because the number was still growing and she needed both hands for the window frame to steady herself. Though her hands were steady, it was just the moment that required anchoring. 78 motorcycles rolled to a stop on her street. 78 men killed their engines in near unison. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was the silence of held attention of large numbers of people deciding together to be still. Dorothy opened her front door. A man was walking toward the porch. He was built in the specific way of someone whose size was not a deliberate project, but an accumulation, the product of decades of physical work and the particular density of a life that had included things that put weight into a frame. His hair was close-cropped gray at the temples. He wore a leather vest over a flannel shirt. His hands, visible in the porch light as he came up the walk, were heavily scarred across the palms and fingers. Old burns. The kind that came from something fast and hot. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her. "Dorothy Callahan," he said. "Graves," she said. He nodded once. His right hand came up to the brim of an invisible hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it might have come from a different time, and she found it neither ridiculous nor performative. It was simply what the gesture was. She looked past him at the street. The men were dismounting, quietly spreading to the sides of the house and down the block, covering positions with the wordless coordination of people who had done similar things in places where doing them incorrectly had lasting consequences. "How many stayed at the compound?" she asked. 11, he said. "Enough to watch what needs watching." "Come inside," she said. "Tell me what you need to know, and I'll tell you what I know, and then we can decide what comes next." He followed her through the door, ducking slightly for the frame, out of an instinct that suggested he had learned long ago to respect low doorways. He stood in her kitchen the way large men stood in small kitchens, making themselves smaller than their bones required. He looked at the table, at the 2 cups she had set out, and something moved across his face that was not grief exactly, but lived near it. Raymond set his table the same way, he said, quietly. 2 cups even when he ate alone. She did not answer that. Some things did not need answering. She poured, and they sat across from each other, and she told him everything, starting from the beginning, from the afternoon 6 weeks ago, when Amy Voss had appeared at her back door in an 80-degree October with long sleeves and the particular careful stillness of a child who had learned to make herself small in all the ways that mattered. She told him about the urgent care clinic and the examination and what the examination had revealed. She told him about the burns, each one described with the clinical precision of someone who had spent 3 decades making precision a professional discipline, because precision was the language that truth required in situations like this one. She told him about filing the report and watching the report dissolve into procedure and politics, and the particular institutional cowardice that presented itself as protocol. She told him about Clifford Voss and Marcus Boone, and the way Voss had stood on her porch the morning after he came home. Graves listened without interrupting, his coffee cup held in both hands, the scarred fingers wrapped around the ceramic. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said Voss has legal custody," he said. "How did that happen?" "Amy's mother, Sandra, died 14 months ago," Dorothy said. "Brain aneurysm, sudden, no history. She was 34 years old. Clifford had been living with her 2 years. He knew the right people. The custody paperwork went through faster than it should have." "Too fast. I had that thought. Sandra had a sister in Phoenix who tried to contest it. She didn't have money for lawyers, and Voss did. Or someone behind Voss did." "Who's behind Voss?" "His name is Vernon Holt," Dorothy said. "He runs a construction company that has won every county contract for the past 6 years. Marcus Boone is his instrument in the sheriff's department. They grew up together, Voss and the Boone brothers in Hope, same street, same decisions, compounding across 30 years of each other's protection." Graves nodded. He looked at the table, then at his right hand, which had begun to tremble slightly. He pressed it flat against the surface until the trembling stopped. She recognized the pattern. Nerve damage. She had seen it in veterans, in men whose wiring had been disrupted by something fast and sudden and loud. She did not mention it. "What do you need from me tonight?" he asked. "I need Amy to be safe until we can build something that lasts," Dorothy said. "Tomorrow morning, Voss will know I called someone. I don't know what he'll do about that." "Where is she now?" "Next door, asleep." Voss came home around 11. His light went out an hour ago. Graves stood. He moved to her window and looked at the house next door, the dark windows and the truck sitting low on its axles in the driveway. And he took out his phone and typed something brief and put it back. "3 of my men will watch that house all night," he said. "If Voss moves toward that door, they'll know before his hand reaches the knob. And if he calls Marcus, then Marcus will drive up Sycamore Road and find 78 motorcycles waiting." Graves looked at her. "That tends to affect the calculation." Dorothy sat back down. She picked up her coffee and held it the way she always held it when her mind was working, both hands close to her chest, the warmth of the cup against her sternum. "You knew Raymond well," she said. It was not quite a question. Graves sat back down. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is organizing something before he speaks it. "I was 17, he said, running from something I should have stayed to face. I'd been in the area 2 days sleeping where I could, no money and no plan. I had done things I'm not proud of. I was on a road outside town at about this hour, and a truck stopped." She watched him. Raymond was driving back from a job, he said. Side work, late hours. He stopped and looked at me for maybe 10 seconds, and then he said, "Get in, son." I don't know why I got in, except that he didn't have the look of a man who wanted something from me. He just looked like a man who had decided to help. Dorothy said nothing. "He didn't ask what I'd done," Graves said. "He drove me to a diner and bought me food, and then drove me to a motel and paid for 2 nights and told me to sleep and think. He said whatever I'd been running from would still be there when I woke up, but I'd think clearer with food and rest." He said it more than once, and eventually I believed him. She looked at her husband's empty chair. "He came back the next morning," Graves said. "Brought a newspaper with job listings circled. Spent 3 hours with me making calls. He didn't know me. I was a vagrant kid who looked like trouble because I was trouble. But he decided I was worth the investment." She heard Raymond in that. The precise economical decision. The absence of sentiment about things that needed doing. "I kept the number he gave me because I swore someday I'd return what he gave me, give it to someone else who needed it. When the Christmas cards stopped coming, I knew he was gone. I'm sorry I didn't reach out. I didn't know if you knew about me or what that would mean to you." "I know now," Dorothy said. Graves nodded. "He was a good man," Dorothy said. "The best I ever met," Graves said. "Until tonight." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. In his face she saw what she had come to recognize after 31 years in rooms where people were required to be honest because the alternative was worse. The particular clarity of someone who had no use left for pretending. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "I can keep Amy safe tonight and probably several nights. But safety that depends on 78 bikers sitting on a street in New Mexico is not a permanent solution. I know that. What we need is evidence. Real evidence, the kind that can't be managed or made to disappear. Whatever Marcus and Voss have been doing goes beyond one child. Corruption this comfortable has been building for years." "I have evidence," Dorothy said. He looked at her. She got up and went to the bedroom. Came back with a folder she had kept separate from the one she submitted to the sheriff's office. She laid it on the table. "Copies of the photographs," she said. "My own examination notes, dated and co-signed by Dr. Renee Hobart at the Urgent Care Clinic. A written statement Amy gave me 3 weeks ago, verbatim, before I filed the official report, when she told me things she hasn't repeated since to anyone." She pointed to a page. "This part," she said. Graves read it. He went very still. "Amy told you her mother never complained of headaches before she died," he said. "Amy described her mother as someone who got tired sometimes, but never had head pain. She said she was like a little camera, and she remembered everything. Sandra Voss was 34 years old with no documented vascular history. A spontaneous intracranial hemorrhage is unusual in that profile. Not impossible, but there are other causes of brain bleeds that look identical on imaging if no one examines the body with a specific question in mind." "You think Voss killed her?" "I think it's possible. I think Amy heard something through her bedroom door the night her mother died that she's been holding without knowing what it meant. And I think the medical examiner who certified the cause of death is a man named Harold Fitch, who retired 6 months after Sandra Voss died and has a house in Taos he could not have afforded on his county salary." Graves looked at her for a long moment. "You put all of this together yourself," he said. "I had time and training, and I was angry," Dorothy said. "Anger focuses the mind." He almost smiled. Almost. Outside a sound. Not loud, just a shift in the ambient quiet of a New Mexico night. Graves was on his feet before Dorothy had processed what changed. He moved to the window in 2 steps. "Voss is awake," he said. "Light just came on." Dorothy stood. She was not afraid. What she felt was something older and more specific than fear. She had felt it on nights in the emergency department when everything was going wrong at once, and the only way through was forward. She straightened her spine. "Then I suggest you go explain to Mr. Voss. She said that the neighborhood has changed since last night." Graves looked at her. In the thin kitchen light, the scars on his hands caught a gleam. He went out the door and down the porch steps and across the yard, and Clifford Voss's porch light was already on. The man himself visible in the window before he opened the front door and stepped out in jeans and no shirt, with a phone in his hand. Voss looked at the street. The street looked back at him. 78 men, some sitting on their bikes, some standing along the curbs, some in folding chairs they had apparently brought and set out along the road. None of them making noise, none of them moving. Just the collective weight of attention from a very large number of people who had all decided without discussion to look directly at him. Voss went very still. His phone screen went dark in his hand. Graves stood at the foot of Voss's porch steps and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He was simply there, and behind him, the street was full of men who were also simply there. And the geometry of the situation had become in the past 90 seconds considerably different from what Voss had calculated when he got out of bed. "Who are you?" Voss said. "A friend of the Callahan family," Graves said. Voss looked toward Dorothy's house. Dorothy was not visible. She was standing back from her window with her arms crossed, watching, cataloging. "You can't do this," Voss said. "This is harassment. I'll call Marcus." Graves took out his own phone and held it out. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll wait." Voss looked at the phone in his hand, looked at the street, put his phone in his pocket. He stood on his porch for another minute. Graves stood at the foot of his steps. Neither of them moved or spoke. Then Voss went back inside. The door closed. The light in his window went out. Dorothy let out a breath she had not consciously been holding. She watched Graves walk back across the yard and up her porch steps and through her front door. He sat down at the kitchen table. She refilled his coffee. They talked until the sky began to lighten. Not about the crisis and not about the plan, but about Raymond. She found herself saying things she had not said to anyone since the funeral. Small, specific things that were the texture of 39 years of marriage. The way Raymond repaired things twice because once was never thorough enough. The 3 dishes he had learned to cook and seen no reason to expand beyond. The Christmas cards he had apparently been sending for decades to a man who turned out to be sitting in her kitchen at 4 in the morning. Graves told her things she had not known. How Raymond had checked in periodically over the years, sent money once during a bad stretch, with a note that said, "Only keep going." How his last Christmas card had come with handwriting shakier than before, and had said simply, "I believe in you. I always have." Dorothy looked at the window. "He didn't tell me he kept in touch," she said. "He wouldn't have wanted you to worry," Graves said. "I would not have worried. I would have approved." Graves looked at her. There was again that fractional shift in his expression, the border between composure and something rawer underneath. "He gave you the number," Graves said. "He gave me the number and told me you would come." He trusted that without qualification. Graves looked at his hands. The scarred right one that had been trembling was still again. "I've spent a long time wondering if I was worth that trust." Dorothy looked at him with the directness she had learned in rooms, where softening the truth was a kindness nobody needed. "You came," she said. "That's the answer." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His posture shifted in the specific way she had already learned to associate with information she was not going to enjoy. "What is it?" she asked. "Marcus Boone just left his house," he said. "He's heading toward the school." Dorothy was on her feet before she finished processing the sentence. She had Amy's schedule by heart. 2nd grade. School started at 8. It was 7:43. "He'll try to pull her before she gets inside," Dorothy said. Graves was already on his phone, 4 words she couldn't quite hear. Then he looked up. "2 of my men are already outside the school. They'll make sure she gets through the door. He won't pull a child out in front of witnesses in broad daylight. And after school. We'll worry about that next, one thing at a time." Dorothy stood with her hands flat on the table. She recognized where she was in the sequence of this. The part where the decisions already made had created momentum, And the momentum was now creating the next decisions, and the space for retreat was narrowing behind them. "Graves," she said, "when Raymond gave you that number, did he tell you what kind of trouble to expect?" "He said you'd tell me yourself," Graves said, "and that whatever it was, it would be worth showing up for. Because you didn't ask for things lightly." Dorothy looked at her husband's chair one more time. He was right about most things she said. She picked up her phone. The morning continued. By noon, Sycamore Road had taken on the quality of an occupation. Organized, quiet, specific. Several of the bikers had produced folding chairs from somewhere and set them up in a loose line along the curb, not blocking traffic, just present. A truck arrived at 10 from a diner 40 minutes out with coffee and food. The men ate and rotated in shifts, 6 departing on motorcycles and returning 6 new ones, taking their positions. The whole sequence seamless and continuous in the way of people for whom this kind of sustained watchfulness was a familiar discipline. Neighbors who had come out to look had stopped looking. Harlow was a small town, and small towns recalibrated quickly to new facts. By mid-morning, the woman at the far end of the block had come out and asked one of the bikers if he needed water. He had said, "Yes, thank you, ma'am," and she had brought out a pitcher. Dorothy worked the phone inside. She called Dr. Renee Hobart at the urgent care clinic, who confirmed her copies of the examination documentation and said she was prepared to speak to anyone who needed to hear it. She called a woman named Naomi Briggs, who had been her nursing school classmate 40 years ago and now ran a state-level child welfare advocacy organization, and who picked up on the second ring because Dorothy had always been someone whose calls she answered on the second ring. She called a retired judge named Earl Briggs, no relation to Naomi, who had left the county bench after refusing to support a custody arrangement he considered suspicious, and who had spent the years since watching the subsequent appointments in Harlow County with the attention of a man who understood what he was watching. She told each of them what she knew: the burns and the photographs in the bail, and the form letter, and the medical examiner in Taos, and the construction contracts, and the Christmas card money Raymond had sent to a man now sitting at her kitchen table. Earl Briggs said, "How many bikers did you say are on your street?" 78, Dorothy said, "and they're just sitting there. They brought their own chairs," she said. "One of them moved a leaf carefully off his motorcycle seat this morning." A pause. Then Earl Briggs said Raymond would have found all of this entirely appropriate. He would have, Dorothy agreed. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a few minutes with her hands in her lap. She was 74 years old. Her knees ached in cold weather. She had been awake since before 2 in the morning, and there was no realistic prospect of sleep until this resolved itself into something stable. She was not unhappy. She was, in the way that purposeful people understood more fully herself than she had been in some time. Graves came back in from the porch, where he had been on his phone. "We have a problem," he said. She looked at him. "The Child Protective Services supervisor for Harlow County is a woman named Bernadette Marsh," he said. "She's the one who sent your photographs back with the form letter. Her brother-in-law is Vernon Holt." Dorothy absorbed this. "So the report didn't fail because the system was slow," she said. "It failed because someone made sure it would." Graves nodded. "There's more. The school called Voss at 11. Someone told them there had been a parental custody concern raised and that Amy should be held until a guardian arrived. Marcus Boone showed up at noon with documentation. He took Amy to the county child welfare office." Dorothy was on her feet. "Technically legal," Graves said. "Emergency protective placement pending review. Voss doesn't have her, but the county does. And the county in this case means Bernadette Marsh. They've moved her inside the system where they control the outcome," Dorothy said. "That's what it looks like." "She needs to know I haven't abandoned her," Dorothy said. "She needs to see that." "I know." Dorothy stood with her hands flat on the table. She had watched this pattern before in patients who postponed addressing something until the addressing required far more than the original prevention would have. In administrative systems that accumulated small corruptions until the weight of them became structural. She recognized the grammar of it. "Can we reach her directly?" she asked. "Not without going through," Marsh Graves said. But there are other approaches. His phone buzzed again and he looked at it, and something changed in his face, in the way she had learned to read. My contact at the state attorney general's office says your friend made some calls. There's interest at the state level. Earl Briggs reached out as well, Dorothy said. He was on the Judicial Oversight Committee 9 years. He has relationships that don't expire. Graves looked at her with a specific recalibration of a person who has understood that what they are dealing with is more organized and more resourceful than they initially estimated. Raymond said, once he said slowly that the most dangerous person in any situation was a retired nurse with an organizational system. He was right about most things, Dorothy said. She stood and went to the window. Outside, the cottonwood was losing leaves in the October wind, yellow and quiet, drifting down onto the nearest motorcycles. One of the bikers looked up at the tree and then at the leaf on his gas tank and picked it up carefully and set it on the curb with the deliberateness of someone performing a small act of order in a situation that required it. "What do we need," Dorothy said, "to get Amy out of Bernadette Marsh's custody and into the hands of someone who won't use her as a chip in someone else's game?" "We need evidence that implicates the whole network," Graves said. "Marsh, Marcus, Voss, Holt. Something that makes their position indefensible to people outside this county. I have the medical documentation. It's a start. Burns on a child prove abuse. They don't prove the corruption that protected the abuser for over a year," Dorothy thought. She stood at the window thinking, with her coffee in both hands, the October light coming through leaf shadows moving across the floor. "Bernadette Marsh approved the original placement of Amy with Voss. When Sandra died," she said, "she processed the paperwork. If she knew what Voss was when she approved it, there will be a record of communication somewhere. Email, phone, something. How do you get access to that?" "I don't," Dorothy said. "But a state attorney general's office with proper cause might. And to establish proper cause, we need Amy's account on record somewhere that Marcus Boone cannot touch it. Which means we need someone to take her statement before Marsh can manage the narrative," Graves said. "I might know someone," Dorothy said. Graves looked at her. "His name is Daniel Hobart, attorney out of Albuquerque. No county ties, no favors owed to anyone in this system. He specializes in child welfare cases. If he takes Amy's statement, it goes into a federal record that nobody in Harlow County can reach. Can you get him here?" "I can ask," Dorothy said. "She has been a nurse for 31 years and a resident of this county for 39, and she knows the people who know the people." She picked up her phone. Graves said, "I know someone too. Let me make a call." They sat at the table and each made their calls, and the October afternoon moved around them. At 6 in the evening, Marcus Boone's cruiser came down Sycamore Road for the first time. He drove slowly, looking at the bikers as he went, and the bikers watched him with the calm, collective attention of people for whom being watched was unremarkable. He parked in front of Dorothy's house and got out and stood, taking in the full extent of the street, the men and the motorcycles, and the folding chairs, and the news van that had appeared at the corner an hour ago. Then he walked up Dorothy's porch steps and knocked. She opened the door. Marcus Boone was in his deputy's uniform badge, prominent, the crisp, professional surface of a man who wore authority the way some people wore expensive clothing, as a statement about the distance between himself and accountability. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "we need to talk about what you've set in motion here." "Do we?" Dorothy said. "You've created a public disturbance. You have no legal right to organize this kind of gathering. I can have every one of these men cited." Graves had appeared behind Dorothy. He said nothing. Marcus looked at him, then back at Dorothy. "You are a 74-year-old woman," he said. "You have no idea what you've started." Dorothy looked at him with the attention she had developed over 31 years of watching people say things that were not the things they meant. "Deputy Boone," she said, "I was a nurse for 31 years. In that time, I learned one consistent truth about men who tell you to trust the proper authorities to handle a situation. They only say it when the proper authorities work for them." Something moved behind Marcus's eyes. "You're going to regret this," he said. "I've had regrets," Dorothy said. "Filing a report about burns on a child's body is not going to be among them. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm she had taught anxious patience for 4 decades. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat down. Graves sat across from her. His right hand was on the table still. He's going to escalate, he said. Yes. Are you frightened? Dorothy considered this, honestly, the way she considered things that deserved honest consideration. No, she said. I'm concerned about Amy. I'm concerned about the morning. I'm not frightened of Marcus Boone. Graves nodded. Outside the street was settling into evening. The remaining news van had a woman standing beside it now, with a phone camera raised. The bikers were building small fires in metal barrels they had apparently brought from wherever they had come from, enough warmth to keep fingers useful in the dropping temperature, enough light to see by. Someone had a harmonica. The sound of it came through Dorothy's window, thin, and traveling something wordless about distance and roads. Dorothy listened to it. Then she picked up her phone and called Barbara Whitaker, whose husband Dale was the county sheriff, and whose watercolors Dorothy had taught for 6 months 2 years ago, and who answered on the second ring with the particular tone of a woman who had been watching the news and waiting to hear from someone who knew more than the news was saying. Dorothy, Barbara said. Is that your street? It is, Dorothy said. Barbara, I need to speak with Dale. Not in any official capacity, just as a neighbor, tonight if possible. A pause, the sound of a door closing, the click of privacy being created. He's home, Barbara said. I think he's been waiting for someone to call. Come by in 20 minutes or I'll send him to you. Send him to me, Dorothy said. It's easier if he comes here and sees it himself. 20 minutes, Barbara said. Dorothy set the phone down, looked at Graves. 20 minutes, she said. He nodded. His expression had the settled quality of a man who had made his peace with waiting, who had learned in places where waiting meant something, that the interval between decisions was not wasted time, but part of the decision itself. Outside, the harmonica continued. The barrel fires burned low and steady. One of the bikers was sitting in a folding chair reading a paperback novel by the light of the nearest flame, his motorcycle beside him, patient as everything else on the street. Dorothy looked at this through her window for a moment. Then she got up and made a fresh pot of coffee because Dale Whitaker had been at Raymond's funeral and had shaken her hand, and he deserved a proper cup when he arrived. And because making coffee was the thing to do when you were waiting for the next thing to arrive, which it always did, which was the nature of sequences, once you had started them moving. Dale Whitaker arrived 18 minutes later in his personal truck. He was wearing a canvas coat with mud on the boots and his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which Dorothy took as a deliberate signal of arriving without the authority the hat represented. She let him in and poured, and the three of them sat at her table. Whitaker and Graves making the rapid assessments of men who are deciding what to make of each other. Dorothy at the head of the table, between them, where the geometry felt right. She opened her folder and pushed it across to Whitaker and told him to look at the last page. He read it. His hands slowed. Amy told you her mother never had headaches, he said. 3 weeks ago, sitting at this table, Dorothy said. Verbatim and witnessed. Whitaker set the folder down. He picked up his coffee. He had the look of a man doing something with his hands, while his mind worked on something it had been working on for some time, and had not until now been permitted to address directly. I've had concerns about the Voss placement since it was approved, he said. I raised them with the court. I was told the paperwork was in order. Who told you? Judge Roy Landis. He retired 18 months ago. His replacement is named Cartwright. She's new and she's clean, and she doesn't know the history of what she inherited. Dorothy looked at him steadily. Dale, has Marcus been running interference on cases before this one? Whitaker was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own answer. I've suspected things I couldn't prove, he said finally. Marcus came up through the department when his uncle ran it. He has relationships I don't have full visibility into. When I've tried to look closely, things got complicated in ways that were clearly meant to discourage looking. Complicated how? The county commissioner's office started asking questions about the department budget. A complaint was filed against me by a defense attorney whose client I'd arrested. Small things but coordinated. Enough to communicate that looking closely had costs. Graves said quietly, "They've been protecting this for a long time." Whitaker looked at him. "What's your interest here?" Dorothy Graves said. "And Amy Voss. And what it represents." Whitaker accepted this without requiring further explanation. He was a man who had lived long enough in a small place to understand that some motivations were self-evident. "What do you need from me?" he asked Dorothy. "Access to Amy," she said. "Tonight, if the attorney I've called arrives in time, he needs to take her statement in a context that creates a protected record before Marsh can manage what she says. Right now, Amy is at Marsh's office. Marsh will resist. Can you override her?" Whitaker was quiet. "I can invoke emergency welfare protocols, pull rank on a placement pending independent review. It's within my authority, but Marsh will file a complaint, and Marcus will make my professional life very difficult." "She'll file a complaint regardless," Dorothy said. "The question is whether the complaint has more weight than Amy's statement taken correctly tonight." Whitaker looked at Graves. "If I do this," he said slowly, "I'm stepping into the middle of something that could end my career." "Marcus Boone is going to have other concerns before long," Graves said. "You know something I don't." "The State Attorney General's office has opened a preliminary inquiry," Dorothy said, "based on material I provided through channels that have nothing to do with this county. It is moving independently of anyone here. But it moves faster if Amy's account is on record in a way that can't be managed locally." Whitaker rubbed his jaw. He looked at the folder, at the table, at the window where outside his county was full of fires that hadn't been there yesterday, and men in folding chairs in a news van recording all of it. "Give me an hour," he said. He stood, put on his hat, looked at Dorothy for a moment. "Raymond would have thought you were more trouble than he bargained for," he said. "Raymond thought I was exactly what he bargained for," Dorothy said. Whitaker almost smiled. He went out. Dorothy looked at Graves across the table. "He's going to do it," she said. "How do you know?" "He put his hat back on when he left," she said. "Men who come to say no keep their authority with them from the moment they arrive. Men who come to be convinced and who decide yes, they put it back on when they go." Graves said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your attorney called back. He's 3 hours out." Dorothy stood and went to the window. Outside, the October dark had come fully down, and the barrel fires burned, and the bikers kept their watch, and the harmonica had stopped, and someone had started singing instead. Just one voice at first, rough and off-key, something old about roads that didn't end. Then another voice joined, and another, until the whole street was singing in the dark, like soldiers around a fire in a country where they had decided to hold the line. She listened to it. Then she turned from the window and went to make the grilled cheese sandwich that she made when Amy came over in the afternoons and was hungry and tired and needed something warm and without complication. Because in an hour, Dale Whitaker was going to call, and when he did, there would be a child coming through her door who would need to be fed before she could be asked to tell her story one more time. One step to the next. That was all there was. That was always enough. Whitaker called at 9:53. Amy had been released to his custody pending independent placement review. He was bringing her to Sycamore Road. 20 minutes. Dorothy hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then she stood and went to the stove because the sandwich was ready and she needed something warm on a plate when Amy came through the door. Graves watched her from his chair. He did not offer commentary. He had the quality of a man who understood that some moments required presence rather than participation. "Tell the men outside," Dorothy said without turning from the stove, quietly, so when she comes around the corner, she doesn't see 78 bikers in panic. Graves went to the door. She heard him speak briefly to whoever was on the porch. Low voices, the register of communication among people who had learned to say necessary things without volume. She cut the sandwich diagonally, which was how she always cut it, and put it on a plate and set it on the table and poured a glass of milk, because Amy drank milk with dinner in the earnest way of a child who had decided it was the correct beverage and was not interested in negotiating. She heard Whitaker's truck in the driveway. Amy came through the door holding her rabbit, a brown stuffed rabbit with one ear repaired with white thread that Amy had brought to Dorothy's house the first afternoon she came over, carrying it the way children carried objects that had become repositories of safety when ordinary safety was not reliable. Dorothy had noted it then. She noted the things children held on to. Amy stopped in the doorway and looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment because they did not need to. Then Amy crossed the kitchen and Dorothy crouched down, which her knees protested, and put her arms around the child. And Amy put her arms around Dorothy's neck, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of grilled bread. "You're here," Amy said. "I've been here all day," Dorothy said. "I'm not going anywhere." She got Amy settled at the table with the sandwich and the milk and sat across from her while she ate. Whitaker had stepped out onto the porch. Graves was in the living room. The kitchen was quiet and ordinary in the way kitchens could be ordinary when everything around them was not. Amy ate most of the sandwich. Then she looked at Dorothy. "Is Mr. Voss coming?" "Number. Is Marcus coming?" "No. You're safe tonight. And tomorrow." Amy looked at the table. Then Dorothy. "Did my mom's head hurt before?" Dorothy held very still. "Where is this coming from?" Amy set down the last piece of her sandwich. She turned her rabbit's ear over the repaired one, tracing the white thread that her mother had used to fix it. "Marcus told me once that my mom complained about headaches for weeks before she died," Amy said. "He said she had a condition. But I don't remember her saying that. She got tired sometimes, but not headaches. I remember everything. She said I was like a camera." Dorothy breathed. "You have an excellent memory," she said. "I've noticed that." She looked at her plate. She was thinking Dorothy could tell in the sequential, organized way that was characteristic of her. "Processing. Can you be in the room," Amy asked, "when I talk to the lawyer?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "And after? Where do I go after?" Dorothy looked at her steadily. "We're working on that question," she said. "Right now you're here and you're safe, and we're going to figure out the rest together." Amy nodded. She picked up her rabbit and looked at it. Then, "Are those motorcycles outside because of me?" "Some of them," Dorothy said. Amy looked toward the window. She couldn't see the street from where she sat, but she knew it was there. "There are so many," she said. "There are 78, Dorothy said. Amy thought about this for a moment. "My mom used to say you could tell what people were really like by what they did when nobody was watching," Amy said. "Because that was when they had to decide for themselves." Dorothy thought about Raymond stopping a truck on a dark road for a vagrant kid with nothing going for him. She thought about men in folding chairs in the October cold. She thought about Dale Whitaker leaving his hat at the door. "Your mother was a wise woman," Dorothy said. Amy put the rabbit on the chair beside her and finished her milk, and then folded her hands on the table in the deliberate way she had when she was preparing to say something she had thought about carefully. "I heard something," she said, "the night my mom died, through my door." Dorothy said nothing. She sat very still and let the silence hold whatever Amy needed to put into it. "I heard voices," Amy said. "My mom's voice and another one. They were arguing. I didn't understand the words. Then my mom stopped talking, and the other voice said something, and then I heard the door. And then it was quiet for a long time and I fell asleep. And in the morning, Marcus was there." The other voice. "Do you know whose it was?" Amy looked at the rabbit. She traced the repaired ear again. "It sounded like Mr. Voss," she said. "But I wasn't sure and I was scared, and Marcus said my mom had been sick and that she had hurt her head and that I shouldn't tell people about that night because it would make the adults sad." Dorothy held the full weight of what Amy had just said. She held it carefully the way you held something that could not be set down carelessly. "Amy," she said, "I'm going to need you to tell Mr. Hobart exactly what you told me. The same words in the same order. Can you do that?" Amy looked up at her. "Will it help?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "It will help very much." Daniel Hobart arrived at 11:40. He was younger than Dorothy had expected. Mid-30s. The particular focused energy of someone who had found work that matched exactly what they had to give. He spoke to Dorothy directly and then to Amy with the same directness, simplified but not condescending, explaining what the interview would mean and how it would be protected and what would happen to what she said. Amy listened and then said, Okay, Dorothy will be in the room. Hobart looked at Dorothy. She nodded. Then, okay, Amy said. I can tell you what I remember. Dorothy sat in the corner chair. Whitaker waited on the porch. Graves sat in the living room, where he had been sitting for 2 hours very still, doing the kind of waiting he was skilled at, the waiting of a person for whom stillness in service of something was its own form of action. Amy talked for 45 minutes. She was, as her mother had said, like a camera. She described things in sequence and with sensory detail and without elaboration beyond what she had observed. She described the night her mother died, the voices through the door, Clifford Voss's face in the morning, the way Marcus had come to the house and told her what to say and not say. She described what had been done to her over the following 14 months in the same careful, sequential way, which objects had been used, which occasions had provoked it, what was said before and after. She did not cry. She had learned that crying brought punishment, so she reported instead, which was its own kind of survival. When she finished, Hobart thanked her with genuine respect. He told her she had done something important. Amy looked at Dorothy. Did I do okay? You did better than okay, Dorothy said. Hobart came to the kitchen doorway with Dorothy, while Amy sat in the living room with Graves, who was talking to her quietly about something Dorothy couldn't hear. This is significant, Hobart said. What she described hearing the night her mother died, if she heard what she described, there was someone else present. That changes the cause of death from suspicious to impossible, as originally certified. Can you get it to the right people? It's going in tonight, Hobart said. Encrypted, secured into the federal system. I'm filing an emergency motion in the morning for federal oversight of Amy's placement. What does that mean for her tonight? It means she stays here under Whitaker's protection, and Marcus would need federal authorization to change that. He won't have it by morning. Dorothy sat down. She had been on her feet since before 2 in the morning, and she felt it now as a fact rather than a complaint. The weight of 22 hours of purposeful effort sitting in her joints. She looked at her husband's empty chair. He had known, she thought. Not the details, not the specifics of this exact sequence of events, but he had known the principle of it, that someday she would need something the proper channels could not provide. And he had built for that eventuality with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. Had sent Christmas cards for 30 years and trusted that the compound interest would pay out in ways he would not personally witness. She heard Amy laugh at something Graves said. A real laugh, brief, and startled the laugh of someone who had forgotten for a moment to be careful. It was the sound of a child temporarily outside the perimeter of her fear, and Dorothy listened to it the way you listen to rare things. Hobart was watching her. Mrs. Callahan, he said, what you built here, the documentation chain, the network of contacts, the sequence of actions. It's not small. Most people in your position would have filed the report and accepted the form letter. Dorothy looked at her husband's chair one more time. Raymond would have said it was the obvious thing to do, she said. Hobart nodded. Then he went to make his calls, and the night moved toward morning, and outside the barrel fires burned low, and the men kept their quiet watch, and the October dark held everything in its grip, and none of it gave way. At 2:30 in the morning, Marcus Boone came back. He came in his cruiser, this time official lights off, and parked in front of Dorothy's house, and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the street. Then he got out and started toward the house. Graves came off the porch to meet him on the front path. She's under federal protection, Graves said. Hobart filed the motion 2 hours ago. You don't have authority here tonight. Marcus's hand moved toward his belt. Draw, that, Graves said quietly, and 60 men wake up. The hand stopped. This isn't finished, Marcus said. You keep saying that, Graves said. But each time you do, the situation is a little less favorable to you. I'd stop saying it. Marcus looked at the house. At the upstairs window where a light burned where Amy was sleeping for the first time in 14 months without the possibility of the man who had hurt her opening a door. You don't know what you've disturbed, Marcus said. I have a good idea, Graves said. Marcus stood for a long moment. Then he went back to his cruiser and sat in it for a minute and then drove away. Dorothy watched from the upstairs window. She had gone up an hour earlier to check on Amy, and had stayed sitting in the chair by the window while Amy slept the particular deep sleep of exhaustion, as she had sat beside patients in rooms where the night needed someone to witness it. She watched Marcus's taillights disappear down the street. Then she went back to her chair and folded her hands in her lap and sat in the quiet house while the barrel fires outside burned their patient low burn and the stars moved overhead in their indifferent arc. In the morning, they would have what Amy had given Hobart. They would have the motion and the state inquiry and Earl Briggs's relationships and the photographs and the medical notes and the timeline that pointed at a man who was not a grieving partner, but something calculated and cold. In the morning, the momentum would shift. For now, there was this: a child breathing steadily in a bed, a street full of men who had decided that showing up was sufficient answer to the question of what kind of people they were, and a woman in a chair by a window who had dialed a number in a dead man's address book and been answered in exactly the way the dead man had promised she would be. Dorothy sat in the chair. She did not sleep. There would be time for sleep after. By 7 in the morning, the shape of the day had clarified, the way days clarified when you had spent the night building the structure for them. Hobart's emergency motion had been received by the federal district court at 4 in the morning and reviewed by a duty judge at 6 and signed at 6:15, establishing federal oversight of Amy's placement pending full hearing. Bernadette Marsh received notification at 6:45. Dorothy imagined her reading it at her kitchen table before work. She did not feel sorry for the imagining. At 8 o'clock, 2 federal agents appeared at the end of Sycamore Road. They reviewed Hobart's documentation with Dorothy and nodded in the way of people who had been handed something, telling a story they had been waiting to be told. Then they drove to the county welfare office. At 8:45, the agents asked Bernadette Marsh to step into a room for a conversation about procedural compliance in the Voss placement. Hobart called Dorothy to tell her this at 9. At 9:30, Graves came inside from the porch, where he had been on his phone for an hour. "They're moving," he said. She poured coffee. "The state inquiry has formally requested all communications between Marsh's office and Vernon Holt's company over the past 3 years," he said. "Subpoena properly filed. They don't need Marcus to cooperate. The records come from Holt's end. And Marcus himself. An agent went to his house this morning. His cruiser is at the station. His personal vehicle is gone." "He's running," Dorothy said. "Or calling in favors," Graves said. "He still has connections. He may believe he can manage this." Dorothy thought about the accumulated weight of what Marcus had spent years building each small accommodation to the network, adding to the next until the whole of it became something that seemed, from inside it, like permanent architecture. She had watched that kind of thinking in other contexts. It always ended the same way. The architecture was only as solid as the foundation, and the foundation was only as solid as the silence of the people who had been keeping it. That silence was ending. "He can't manage this," she said. No, Graves agreed. Amy came downstairs at 8:30 in her clothes from the day before, her rabbit under her arm, her hair unbrushed, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the 2 adults at the table, the way she looked at rooms when she first entered them, reading what they contained. "Is it better?" she asked. "Getting there," Dorothy said. Amy looked at Graves. He looked back at her. "You stayed all night," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. Dorothy said you would." Graves glanced at Dorothy. "She said the people outside were the kind that showed up," Amy said. "She said that was how you knew." Graves was quiet for a moment. "Your dad would have understood that," Dorothy told him. He looked at his hands, the right one still on the table. "Is there something I can do?" Amy asked. She was looking at both of them with the practical directness that Dorothy had come to think of as her essential characteristic. The child who had survived what she survived had not done it by waiting to be told. She had done it by paying attention and doing the next available thing. "Can you eat breakfast?" Dorothy said. Amy sat down. Dorothy made eggs. By noon, the news vans had multiplied to 4 at the end of the block, and a reporter had posted a live segment describing 78 motorcycles, a federal court order, and an unnamed retired nurse at the center of what was being called a child welfare investigation, with potential implications for multiple county offices. Dorothy watched 30 seconds of it on her phone and then put the phone face down on the table. "They're going to want to speak to you," Graves said. "Eventually," she said, "when I have something worth saying." You always have something worth saying. Having something to say and having something worth saying are different, she said. Worth saying requires timing. Graves almost smiled. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed in the way she had learned to read. Marcus was found, he said. He was at Vernon Holt's construction office. They're both being asked to come in for questioning. The agents weren't presenting it as a request. Dorothy nodded. She sat with this for a moment, the particular satisfaction of a sequence arriving at its correct position after being held incorrectly for too long. Not the end. There were still pieces to move, still formal processes to complete. Courts and records in the grinding institutional machinery that worked slowly, but worked. But the momentum had shifted, and that was the essential thing. The people who had been protecting the harm were now defending themselves, which was a different geometry entirely. She looked out the window at the street. The remaining bikers were still there, the morning rotation underway. Men who had agreed to stay, staying. A few had started talking to neighbors over the fence line. The woman from the end of the block had come out again with her water pitcher. One of the bikers had helped her with a stuck gate latch, and they were now discussing something in the yard that involved her gesturing at a flower bed and him nodding with apparent interest. Graves was watching her. "You should rest," he said. "I will," she said. "When?" "When Amy's placement is secured and Voss is charged and there's a record that makes it permanent. Then I'll rest. That could take weeks. Then I'll rest in a few weeks." He looked at her. The expression in his face had been developing across the day and across the night before it's some kind of recognition that was not surprise, because she thought Raymond had prepared him not to be surprised by this kind of steadiness, but it was acknowledgement. The look of a person who saw what was in front of them and did not look away. "What did Raymond tell you about me?" Dorothy asked. Graves considered. "He said you were the most competent person he had ever known, and that he was glad you had chosen him because he would not have had the courage to choose you first." Dorothy looked out the window. "He was wrong about the courage," she said, "but he was right about most things." She picked up her coffee. In the room next door, Amy was coloring at the living room table. Dorothy could hear the small sounds of it, crayon on paper, the occasional scrape of a color being applied with conviction. Outside, the harmonica started again. The same tune as the night before, wordless, in traveling, something about roads and the spaces between the places that roads connected. Dorothy listened. Then she picked up her phone and began making the next calls. Clifford Voss was arrested at 3:17 in the afternoon. Whitaker called Dorothy directly to tell her, in the brief, unembroidered way of a man who had learned that some information was most respectful when delivered plainly. Voss was in custody on charges of child abuse felony endangerment and obstruction of a Child Protective Services investigation. Additional charges were pending review of the evidence, now in federal hands. Bail had been set at a level that was not being met. Dorothy said thank you and ended the call. She told Amy at dinner. Amy was eating the soup Dorothy had made because soup felt right for the evening, warm and uncomplicated. She set her spoon down when Dorothy told her. She looked at the table for a moment. "He won't come back?" she asked. "Not while these charges stand," Dorothy said. "And we're going to make sure there are more charges and better ones, and that they stick." Amy picked up her spoon. She ate 2 more spoonfuls. Then she set it down again. "I don't know what to feel," she said. "That's all right," Dorothy said. "You don't have to feel any one thing right now." Amy nodded. She looked at her rabbit on the chair beside her. "Is he going to say it wasn't him?" she asked. "Like Marcus did." "Some people will argue that," Dorothy said. "That's why what you told Mr. Hobart matters. It goes in front of people who have no reason to argue against it." Amy thought about this. Then she said, "Dorothy, yes, if they look at what happened to my mom, if they find out it wasn't her head." She paused. "Will that help, or will it just be sad?" Dorothy held the weight of that question. It was the question of a child doing the math of grief and justice together, calculating whether truth was worth its cost, when the cost was the loss of ambiguity. Both things can be true at the same time, Dorothy said. It can be sad, and it can help. Truth usually is both of those things. Amy considered this carefully. Then she picked up her spoon and finished her soup. After dinner, Graves came in from outside, where he had been managing the gradual departure of his men. Some were returning to jobs and families, in the ordinary world they had left to stand on a street in New Mexico for 2 days and 2 nights. He was specific and personal with each one, as they left not a general dismissal, but an acknowledgement that was particular to each man. Dorothy watched this from the window. He sat down across from her when he came in. "Half have gone back," he said. "The rest will stay through tomorrow until the placement is secured in writing." Dorothy looked at him. "You don't have to stay yourself." "I know." They looked at each other. "Raymond left me that number because he trusted you to be worth it," she said. "He was right. I want you to know I see that." Graves was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Callahan, "Dorothy, there's something I haven't said that I should." She waited. "Amy is going to need a permanent placement," he said. "Long-term, stable with someone she trusts. The federal oversight protects her for now. It doesn't make her a home." "I know that." Graves looked at her steadily. "I want to make sure Hobart recommends you." She held his gaze. "I'm 74 years old," she said. "You're in better health than men I know who are 50, he said. "You have a stable home, 31 years of professional care experience, a community that has known you for decades, and a relationship with Amy that already exists. You're the most qualified person for this. The court may not agree. The court will see what Hobart argues," Graves said, "and Hobart will argue what's best for Amy. I've already spoken to him." Dorothy sat with this. She thought about the 2 coffee cups, the ghost of 39 years of breakfast, the house that had been quiet in a way that was not peace, but vacancy. She thought about Amy's laugh from the living room, brief and startled. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," she said. "I know, but I've been thinking about what Raymond would have done. He wouldn't have stopped at solving the immediate crisis. He would have made sure the solution lasted." Dorothy looked at the table, at the grain of the wood that she had looked at across 39 years of mornings. "I'll need to talk to Amy," she said. "Of course. And to Hobart, and to Dale Whitaker, and eventually to the court. They'll find exactly what I found," Graves said. "What did you find?" He looked at her with the directness of a man who had learned in hard places to say what he meant and mean what he said. "Someone who shows up," he said, "even when showing up costs more than expected. Someone Raymond was right to trust without reservation." Dorothy pressed her lips together and looked at the window and did not let herself cry at her own kitchen table, which was a matter of principle. "Don't make me cry," she said. "I'm stating facts," Graves said. "I was told I got that from Raymond." Dorothy almost laughed. It surprised her. A photograph arrived in January that changed what Dorothy understood about the depth of what she was standing in. It came through Hobart, forwarded from the state forensic pathologist in Santa Fe, a woman named Dr. Agnes Morrow, who had no connection to Harlow County and had been asked to review the original medical examiner's report on Sandra Voss as part of the federal investigation now formally underway. Dorothy read the summary 3 times at her kitchen table. The original cause of death had not been certified correctly. The original examiner, Harold Fitch, had marked the case as spontaneous intracranial hemorrhage without adequate investigation of alternative causes. Dr. Morrow's re-examination of the available imaging and documentation found findings consistent with blunt force trauma to the posterior skull that had not been documented in Fitch's report. Harold Fitch, who had retired to a house in Taos 6 months after Sandra Voss died, who had received 3 consulting fees from Holt Construction in the 18 months prior to her death payments, described on his tax filings as general advisory services, and that had no obvious professional basis. Dorothy set the summary down. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and the quiet kitchen around her, and the weight of what she now knew sitting in her chest, where certainty sat when it was not comfortable. She had suspected it. She had written it in her notes as a possibility. She had shared it with Graves and with Hobart and with the Attorney General's contact as a thread worth pulling. But suspicion and confirmed forensic evidence were different things, and the difference sat in her now as something between grief and a cold, clear anger. Clifford Voss had killed Sandra Voss, had killed Amy's mother, and Harold Fitch had certified it as natural and walked away to a house in Taos, and Marcus Boone had been at the scene in the morning and told an 8-year-old girl not to talk about the night her mother died. 14 months of it. 14 months of Amy living in the same house as the man who had done it. Dorothy called Hobart. "I've read the summary," she said. "I thought you should have it directly," he said. "The DA has been in contact with the federal prosecutors. There will be a superseding indictment, additional charges against Voss and potentially against Fitch. And Marcus. Marcus is cooperating partially," Hobart said. "He's been confirming information the investigators already have, hoping that limits his exposure." Dorothy thought about Marcus the badge, polished the flag pin on his collar, the crisp, professional surface of a man who had spent years confusing the appearance of authority with its exercise. "What do I need for the hearing?" "Your documentation is already in the record," Hobart said. "I'll present the placement recommendation. Whitaker has submitted a supporting letter. You'll have the opportunity to speak if you choose." "I'll choose," Dorothy said. "I expected that," Hobart said. There was warmth in it. After she hung up, she went to the bedroom closet and took down Raymond's box. Not for the index card this time. For a photograph she had looked at once and put away because the first time she had seen it, the grief had not been ready for it. The photograph was from before they met. Raymond at 22, standing in front of a truck she did not recognize, grinning in the particular way of a young man who found the world manageable and expected it to stay that way. Beside him stood someone she did not know, a slightly older man with a hand on Raymond's shoulder, both of them looking at the camera with the uncomplicated confidence of people who believed they were standing at a beginning. She looked at this photograph for a long time. Then she carried it to the mantelpiece and set it there between the ceramic jar and the candlestick Raymond had made, where she could see it from the kitchen table. She told Graves about the forensic finding that evening. He came by on Thursday afternoons now with the consistency of someone who had accepted an ongoing responsibility. He would sit at the table and drink coffee and hear the updates and offer what he knew from his own contacts. And Dorothy had noticed that the visits were becoming less about the crisis and more about the continuation of something the crisis had started. He went very still when she told him about Dr. Morrow's finding. "Amy should know," he said finally, "in the right way at the right time." "She already suspects," Dorothy said. "She told me her mother didn't have headaches. She's been holding this piece for 14 months without knowing what it was part of. Some part of her understands what she holds, even when she doesn't have the language for it." "Does she know what she knows?" "Not fully, but I think the part of her that walked next door to knock on my door knew something needed to happen. Children understand things before they have words for them." Graves looked at her. "You're already thinking in terms of years with her." Dorothy considered this. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." He nodded. Something in his expression had been developing across the weeks since October, since the night he had sat across from her at 2 in the morning with his coffee. It was not sentimental. Graves was not a sentimental man in the way that word usually meant. But there was something in him that had been finding its shape around a specific point, the way hard things found their shape when they located what they had been looking for without knowing they were looking. The photograph on the mantelpiece caught his eye. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Who is the other man?" he asked. "I don't know," Dorothy said. "It was in Raymond's box. I never asked him." Graves stood and went to look at it more closely. He was quiet for a long time. Dorothy watched him. "That's my grandfather's truck," he said. She looked at him. "I grew up with a photograph of that truck," he said slowly. "My grandfather drove it when I was young. It burned in a barn fire when I was 9. He said it was the best truck he ever owned." He pointed to the man beside Raymond. "That's my grandfather." Dorothy stood. She came to look at the photograph. "They knew each other before Raymond stopped for you on that road," she said. "Before I was born," Graves said. He looked at her. "Our families have been connected longer than either of us understood." Dorothy thought about Raymond. who had been precise about everything, who had sent Christmas cards for 30 years and written, "For when everything else has failed," and trusted a sequence he would not live to see complete. He knew, she said. He had to have known, Graves said. He would have known who my grandfather was. When he stopped for me on that road, he was keeping a connection already in place. And the number he gave you was already a thread he intended to keep running, Graves said, through me, for as long as it needed to run. Dorothy pressed her lips together. She looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece for a long moment. He planned it without planning it, she said. He just understood what connected things were worth maintaining. He always understood that, Graves said. They stood together in the quiet house, with the photograph between them and the kitchen light warm behind them. Then Dorothy went back to the table and poured fresh coffee, and they both sat down as they had so many evenings now, and the house settled around them the way houses settled when the right people were in them. The formal hearing for Amy's placement was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. Dorothy had spent 3 weeks building the record that Hobart would present, the same methodical preparation she had brought to everything else. Each piece of documentation confirmed and positioned and cross-referenced so that what Judge Cartwright received was not a collection of concerns, but a coherent argument. Judge Catherine Cartwright was new to the bench and had no connection to the Harlow County networks that had protected Clifford Voss and Marcus Boone across the years of their arrangement. Whitaker had confirmed this. Hobart had confirmed this independently. Dorothy had formed her own assessment based on a review of Cartwright's prior rulings, which she had obtained through channels that were entirely legal and simply required knowing which channels to use. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of November sky that was blue in the specific way of winter skies, hard and without warmth, but honest about it. Dorothy wore the gray dress she had worn at Raymond's funeral, and several times since for occasions that required her to be both serious and present. She had worn it to difficult things, and she thought of it as carrying a track record. The courthouse in Harlow was modest and managed to project the institutional weight it was meant to project. Dorothy sat at the petitioner's table beside Hobart and looked at the bench and thought about what needed to happen here and what she intended to say when the opportunity came. Graves was in the gallery with Whitaker. Earl Briggs had driven up from where he now lived, which Dorothy had not expected and which moved her more than she intended. He nodded to her when she came in. She nodded back. Amy was not in the courtroom. Hobart had arranged for her to wait with a court-appointed child advocate in a room down the hall. Dorothy had met the advocate, asked 3 questions, and approved of her answers. Hobart presented the placement recommendation with the clarity and specificity that Dorothy had come to expect. He moved through the documentation methodically. The original medical record, Dorothy's examination notes, Amy's statement, Dr. Morrow's revised forensic finding on Sandra Voss's death. The communications network between Marsh and Holt now entered into the federal investigation record. The systematic protection that had allowed Voss to continue for over a year, unchallenged. He presented Dorothy's background, 31 years of nursing, her standing in the community, Whitaker's letter, the testimony of Dr. Renee Hobart from the urgent care clinic, supporting statements from 3 neighbors who had known Dorothy and Raymond for decades. He presented Amy's own expressed wish. Then Dorothy spoke. She had not prepared remarks. Prepared remarks were for situations that required a performance. This was a woman speaking plainly to a judge about a child and what she understood about that child and what she intended to offer. She told Cartwright about the first afternoon Amy came to her door, not asking for anything specific, just appearing the way children appeared when the place they were supposed to be was not the kind of place they could rest in. She told Cartwright about the long sleeves in October warmth, about the rabbit with the repaired ear, about the particular quality of Amy's patience, the patience of a child who had learned to wait out bad stretches by going somewhere inside herself where the bad stretches couldn't easily reach. She told Cartwright about what Amy had said sitting at her kitchen table, about not remembering headaches, about being like a camera. She told Cartwright what she could offer. The house, the stability, the professional background, The network of people who had demonstrated across the past 3 weeks that they considered this a matter of collective responsibility. She mentioned Graves by name and described what he had organized not as a performance but as a fact about what was available to Amy. She said, "I am 74 years old, and I know that is a relevant consideration, and I will address it directly if the court wishes. What I would say is this. The most important thing a child in Amy's situation needs is not the ideal set of circumstances. The most ideal circumstances she might have had were the ones she was born to, and those were taken from her through the deliberate actions of adults who chose their own interests over her safety. What she needs now is consistent, reliable, specific love from someone who already knows her. I already know her, and she knows me. That is not a small thing." She sat down. Cartwright was quiet for a moment. She looked at her papers. Then she looked at Dorothy. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "I've reviewed every piece of documentation in this record. I want to ask you one question directly." Dorothy waited. "What happens to Amy when you're no longer able to care for her?" Dorothy had expected this question. It was the correct question. Any judge worth the title asked it. "The network that came to my street 3 weeks ago does not dissolve when the immediate crisis is resolved," she said. "Graves Mercer specifically has spoken to me about this with directness and consistency. Beyond him, I have 2 nieces in Albuquerque who are aware of Amy's situation and have indicated willingness to step into a caretaking role if I become unable to maintain one. I have a community in this town that has been my community for 39 years. And I have a child who is already in the ways that matter most, mine. Amy will not be alone when I am gone. She has never been as surrounded as she is right now." Cartwright looked at the papers again. She made a note. Then she looked up. "I'm going to order a 60-day supervised placement period," she said, "after which, if the supervisory reports are satisfactory, we'll formalize the arrangement. Monthly check-ins with the child advocate for the first year. Documentation of Amy's therapeutic progress. A professional health assessment updated at 6 months." Dorothy said, "Understood." Cartwright looked at her steadily for a moment, one composed woman assessing another. "I think she's lucky to have you," she said. The gavel came down. Dorothy sat for a moment after Cartwright left. The courtroom had the particular quality of rooms, after formal proceedings, the air still holding the residue of what had been decided. The benches emptying around her. Hobart put a hand briefly on her shoulder. She nodded. Graves was at her side when she stood. He did not say anything. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between where they had started and where they were now was present between them, and did not need to be named. Earl Briggs took her hand in both of his. "Raymond would have been insufferably pleased with himself," he said. "He would have been insufferable," Dorothy agreed. He squeezed her hand and left. Whitaker nodded to her from the doorway. One by one the room emptied until it was Dorothy and Graves and the clerk gathering papers at the far end. Dorothy picked up her bag. She straightened her dress. She looked at the bench where Cartwright had sat, and then at the door. "Let's go get Amy," she said. They went. The child advocate brought Amy out to the hallway, and Amy looked at Dorothy's face the way she always looked at faces in rooms when she first entered them, reading what they held. Whatever she saw was sufficient because she crossed the hallway quickly, and Dorothy put her arms around her, and Amy pressed her face against Dorothy's shoulder and said the single word that was the entire shape of the question. "Home." "Yes," Dorothy said. "Home." Amy pulled back. She looked at Graves standing a few feet behind Dorothy, the scarred hands at his sides, the expression of a man who had learned to stand at a careful distance from things he was afraid to disrupt by wanting them. Amy looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My mom would have liked you." Graves looked at her. Something moved through his face. "I think I would have liked her," he said. Amy nodded. Then she held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it, carefully the scarred right hand around the small 8-year-old hand, and they walked together down the courthouse hallway toward the door. Dorothy followed. Outside, the November morning was cold and clear, and the town of Harlow extended in every direction in its small and ordinary and entirely particular way. The hardware store, the diner, the gas station, the elementary school 3 blocks east, where Amy would go on Monday morning, and where the teacher in the second-grade classroom had been told quietly that this child had come through something hard and deserved patience. Graves got his motorcycle from the block away, and the sound of it starting filled the November air with the register that Dorothy now associated with the events of the past 3 weeks. The vibration that had entered her sternum at 2 in the morning on an October night and announced that something was changing. He pulled up beside the car. "I'll follow you home," he said. Amy buckled herself in and held the rabbit in her lap. Dorothy got behind the wheel. She looked in the rearview mirror at Graves on the bike waiting. She started the car. "Ready," she said. Amy looked at the town through the window. Then she looked at Dorothy. "Ready," she said. Dorothy pulled out of the parking lot and drove home. Sycamore Road in November was stripped of leaves and clear the cottonwoods standing in its bare November honesty against a sky that had gone the specific gray of late autumn. Dorothy pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment. Graves parked at the curb. He cut the engine. The street went quiet. Amy got out and stood in the driveway and looked at the front of the house the way you looked at something you were meeting for the first time, even when you had seen it before. Dorothy had noticed this about Amy. She looked at things as though she was deciding whether they were real, whether they were going to stay. "We'll get your things from next door this afternoon," Dorothy said. "Whatever you want to bring." Amy looked at Voss's house. It had been quiet since the arrest. Dark windows, no truck in the driveway, the porch light that had burned all through the 14 months of Amy's time there, now switched off. "I don't want most of it," Amy said, "just my mother's things." "Then we'll get those." Amy nodded. She reached out and took Dorothy's hand. They stood in the driveway in the November morning. Graves came up the walk. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at them, these two people who had come to this moment from opposite directions along a line that had been laid down before either of them existed. He had the look of a man who understood that he was a witness to something, and who understood that witnessing was not a lesser role than acting, but was sometimes the essential one. Dorothy looked at him. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them. Dorothy at the head, Amy across from Graves, the rabbit, propped on the chair beside her in its customary position. The November light came through the window in the way it had come through for 39 years of mornings, and the house held them the way it had always held the people who sat at this table, with the specific warmth of a place that had been lived in well. Amy told Graves about the rabbit, how she had gotten it when she was 4 and named it simply Rabbit because she had been a direct child who saw no reason to complicate a self-evident situation. How one ear had torn and her mother had repaired it with white thread from a sewing kit that Amy still had. Graves listened with his full attention and asked 2 questions that demonstrated he was actually listening. Amy leaned slightly forward in her chair the way she did when someone was meeting her at her level. Dorothy watched them both. She thought about Raymond. Who had stopped a truck on a dark road and paid something forward that was still paying forward decades later in a kitchen in New Mexico on a November morning? She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece, the 2 young men in the truck, the connection she had not known existed that had been the quiet infrastructure of everything that followed. For when everything else has failed, call this, they will come. He had known. Not the details, not this specific morning or this specific child or this specific table, but the principle of it that someday the proper channels would fail and she would need something that was not a channel, but simply people deciding to show up. He had built for that the way he built things quietly and methodically, entrusting the structure to hold. "Is there something I can do?" Amy asked. She was looking at both of them with the practical directness that was her most essential characteristic. "Can you eat lunch?" Dorothy said. Amy sat up straighter. "Yes." Dorothy made sandwiches. She cut them diagonally because that was how she always cut them, and Amy had noticed and approved. They ate at the table, and the conversation moved through the ordinary topics of people who had been through something together And we're now in the part that came after, which was the living. After lunch, Amy went to her room to begin arranging it. Dorothy could hear her moving around, the sounds of a child claiming space in a house that had been waiting longer than either of them had known for the right people to fill it. Graves stayed at the table. He had a second cup of coffee. His right hand was still on the table and had been still for most of the past week, Dorothy noticed, as the acute stress of the crisis had moved into the steadier work of resolution. He said, "I have a daughter." Dorothy looked at him. She waited. "Her name is Sarah," he said. "She's 17. I haven't seen her since she was 9. Her mother got a restraining order after I came back from Afghanistan. I wasn't well. I was angry and I was drinking and I scared people who had reason to be scared of me." She said nothing. "I've been trying to reach her for 4 years," he said. "Letters, phone calls, birthday cards. Her mother intercepts most of it, but some gets through. I think Sarah reads some of it." "Are you in contact with her mother now?" "No. The restraining order lapsed, but the relationship didn't. She's moved twice. I know the general area." Graves looked at his hands. "You're wondering if you should try harder," Dorothy said. "I'm wondering if trying harder is the right thing for Sarah," he said, "or if the trying is for me." Dorothy thought about that. The distinction he was making was a real one, and she respected him for making it. "What does Sarah know about you?" she asked. "What her mother has told her." "Which is accurate as far as it goes. I was dangerous. I was unpredictable. I made the people who loved me afraid. Those things were true." "Are they still true?" "Less than they were," he said. "But I don't know how to prove that from a distance to someone who has every reason not to trust the evidence." Dorothy looked at the window, at the cottonwood bare and clear, standing in the November yard. "Amy," she said, "has been looking at you all morning. The way she looks at things, she is deciding whether to trust." He was quiet. "She told you her mother would have liked you," Dorothy said. "Amy does not say things she doesn't mean. She says what she observes." Graves looked at the door to the hallway, beyond which Amy was in her room, arranging things. "I know," he said. "She is going to write you a letter," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "I don't mean that I've planned it," she said. "I mean that it is the kind of thing she will decide to do. She is a child who does the next useful thing when she understands what the next useful thing is. She has been paying attention to you for 3 weeks, and she will have things she wants to say. And the way she says them will be the way she always says things, which is directly and without embellishment. And when Sarah reads that letter, if she reads it, she will know it comes from someone who has no reason to tell her anything other than what they observed." Graves was quiet for a long time. "Do you think it would reach her?" he asked. "I think it has a better chance than anything else currently available," Dorothy said, "because it will come from outside the grief and the history, from a 9-year-old girl who looked at you and saw someone worth trusting and wanted to say so." He pressed his lips together. He looked at the table. Then he said, "All right." Dorothy nodded. She stood and cleared the cups, and he helped without being asked, and they moved around the kitchen in the comfortable, practical division of two people who had spent enough time in the same space to have stopped being deliberate about it. Outside, the November afternoon was settling toward evening, the sky going amber at the edges, the cottonwood casting thin shadow lines across the yard. Down the street, the remaining bikers were at their bikes, the last ones preparing to return to their own lives and families. The sustained watch finally releasing into ordinary time. Dorothy stood at the window and watched one of them, the man she had seen pick a leaf off his motorcycle seat that first morning, say something to a neighbor's child who had come to the fence to look. The child laughed at whatever the man said. The man smiled. Small, ordinary human transactions across the particular fence lines of a particular day. Graves came and stood beside her. "What happens next?" he asked. "Not about Amy specifically, just in general. What does your life look like now?" Dorothy considered this honestly. "It looks like appointments," she said. "Therapy for Amy, court check-ins, school meetings, Hobart's calls. It looks like the long, patient work of building something in the place where something was broken." She paused. "It looks like mornings at this table with someone across from me again." He was quiet. "That's what you wanted," he said. It was not a question. It's what Raymond built for, she said. I don't think he knew exactly what form it would take, but he understood the principle of it, that things connected across years were worth maintaining, that people worth investing in were worth following through on, that the long view was the correct view. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. He was right, Graves said. He usually was, Dorothy said. She stepped back from the window. The evening was coming down, and there was dinner to make, and tomorrow was a school day, and the ordinary machinery of an ordinary life was assembling itself around her. And she found this, after everything, the most profoundly satisfying thing she had felt in 8 years. She went to the refrigerator to consider what was in it and what it could become. Graves leaned against the counter. Can I ask you something, he said. You can ask me anything, Dorothy said. Did you know when you dialed that number what you were starting? Not just for Amy, for all of it. Dorothy looked at the contents of her refrigerator. She thought about October morning and the index card in Raymond's handwriting and the 78 motorcycles she had heard before she could see them. I knew I was calling a number Raymond had told me to call when everything else had failed, she said. I knew he trusted it, so I trusted it. And the rest. The rest is what happened when people decided to show up, she said. That's all it ever is. The decision to show up, and then the showing up, and then whatever comes from that. Raymond understood it. I've spent 39 years learning it from him. She took out what she needed for dinner. Amy is going to need this meal, and tomorrow's meal, and the one after that, and I intend to be here for all of them. She set the ingredients on the counter. Stay for dinner, she said. He said, yes. Amy came back to the kitchen at 5 o'clock with her rabbit under her arm and her hair brushed, which she had apparently done on her own initiative. And she sat at the table and watched Dorothy cook with the focused attention of a child who was deciding that learning this was the next useful thing. Dorothy showed her the steps as she went, not as a lesson, just as the natural sharing of the activity between two people in a kitchen. Graves set the table. 3 places, the cups in their correct positions, the napkins folded. He did it with the quiet deliberateness of a man who understood what the gesture meant and intended it. They ate together in the November evening, the 3 of them, at the kitchen table where Raymond had eaten for 39 years in the house that had been waiting to be full again, which it now was in all the ways that mattered. The legal proceedings moved forward in the weeks that followed with the patient, bureaucratic momentum that Dorothy had prepared for. Federal charges were filed against Clifford Voss, Marcus Boone, Vernon Holt, and Harold Fitch. Bernadette Marsh entered a cooperation agreement. The County Child Welfare Office underwent a full administrative review, and the people who had been managing it in service of the network no longer worked there. Judge Cartwright's monthly check-ins were thorough and professional. Each time the child advocate visited, she spent an hour with Amy and an hour with Dorothy and documented what she found. What she found each time was a child who was slowly learning what safe felt like from the inside. This was the slower and more important kind of learning. It did not move in a straight line. It moved the way healing moved, with setbacks and plateaus and occasional days that felt like standing still, and then days that felt like being carried forward by something that had been building without visible progress. Amy was in therapy with a woman in Albuquerque who had a direct approach that Amy described after the 3rd session as she doesn't pretend everything is fine. Dorothy took this as a significant endorsement. The compound outside Russ Creek, where Graves lived with the men who had come to Sycamore Road that October night, looked different in winter. The desert stripped of its summer colors, the sky enormous and clear in the way of high desert winter skies, the distances between things more visible when the scrub brush went dormant. Dorothy brought Amy there on a Saturday in December. She had asked Graves first, and he had said yes, with a particular directness he brought to things he wanted. She had asked Amy, and Amy had said yes, with the particular directness she brought to things she had been thinking about. The compound was not what Dorothy had imagined, though she had tried to imagine it accurately. It was simply where men lived who had found each other useful in the specific way that people who had been through similar things found each other useful. There were arbors and small structures, and a mechanic shop that smelled of oil and metal, and the particular organized chaos of work in progress. There were fires burning in barrels against the December cold. There were dogs. Amy looked at all of it with the evaluating attention she brought to new places. Then she asked if she could see the mechanic shop. Prophet was inside working on something. He had the lean, deliberate quality of a man who had learned economy of motion in places where wasted motion had costs, and he looked at Amy with the same directness she brought to everything. "I hear you want to learn about engines," he said. "Dorothy told me you could teach me," Amy said. "Dorothy told me you were worth teaching," Prophet said. "Those are two different assessments." He looked at her steadily. "I don't waste time on students who are going to stop paying attention. I pay attention to everything," Amy said. Prophet looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the motorcycle frame in the center of the shop. "Come here," he said. Amy went. Dorothy stood in the doorway of the mechanic shop and watched her daughter walk toward a disassembled motorcycle with the posture of a child who had decided she was ready for the next thing. Graves came and stood beside her. "She'll be good at this," he said. "She's good at most things she decides to do," Dorothy said. "She has her mother's attention." They stood in the doorway while Amy and Prophet began the slow work of a mechanic explaining an engine to someone who had never seen one taken apart. Amy asking 2 questions for every explanation, Prophet answering each one with the precision of someone who had taught things before and knew that imprecision was disrespectful to the student. "Are you all right?" Graves asked Dorothy. She considered the question. She was 60 miles from home on a December Saturday in the mechanic shop of a desert compound full of veterans and the particular history of men who had found each other after their original families had not been able to hold them. She was standing next to a man who was carrying a debt forward that had originated with her husband's grandfather before she was born. She was watching her daughter lean over a motorcycle engine with an expression of pure, focused interest that was the most unguarded Dorothy had seen on her face since October. "I'm very well," Dorothy said. "Thank you." "I'm glad you called the number," Graves said. "I'm glad Raymond left it," Dorothy said. They stood together in the cold doorway while the December light moved across the desert and the fires burned in their barrels, and the mechanic shop held the warmth of the work inside it. In January, Amy wrote the letter. Dorothy did not read it. She had offered to help with spelling if needed and had been consulted twice. The letter, when Amy sealed it, was 2 pages in her careful hand, the penmanship of a child still negotiating between printing and cursive, tipping from one to the other at moments of particular concentration. Graves held it for a long moment when Dorothy gave it to him. "She's not writing it to fix anything," Dorothy told him. "She's writing it because she has something to say, and she says the things she has to say. That's all." He mailed it. 3 weeks later in February, Sarah wrote back. He came on a Thursday afternoon to tell Dorothy. He sat across from her at the table and put the letter down and did not say anything. Dorothy looked at it, then at him. Then she read the first line he indicated with his finger, the finger not quite steady. The first line said, "Amy says you're the kind of person who shows up. I want to believe that." Dorothy folded the letter and gave it back to him. "That's Raymond," she said. He looked at her. "That exact quality," Dorothy said. "The willingness to believe forward on insufficient evidence. To decide that something is worth the risk of being wrong. He had it. He gave it to you. You gave it to Amy. Amy sent it to Sarah. That's Raymond, still in motion, 30 years on." Graves held the letter with both hands. The right one trembled slightly, as it always did when he was holding something he was afraid of dropping. Amy came home from school at 3:15 and dropped her backpack in the hallway and came to the kitchen and saw Graves at the table. She wrote back, Amy said. It was not a question. She wrote back, Graves said. Amy sat down. She put her hands on the table in the deliberate way she had when she was going to say something she had thought about. "When you see her," she said, "when she lets you. Can I come?" Graves looked at this child who had looked at his scarred hands and his difficult face and his difficult history and written 2 pages to a stranger on his behalf because she had decided it was the next useful thing to do. "Yes," he said, "when she lets me, you can come." Amy nodded. She picked up her backpack and went to get a snack and came back and sat at the table with her homework in the ordinary way of a child whose afternoon has an ordinary shape. Dorothy sat across from Graves. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, at the two young men in the truck. "Do you think he knew how far it would go?" Graves asked. "No," Dorothy said. "He knew the principle. He trusted the people. The rest is what always happens when people decide to show up." "What's that?" She picked up her coffee. "Time," she said, "and people deciding to show up." Outside, the February light was flat and cold, and the cottonwood was beginning to show the earliest signs of the year turning, the buds not yet open, but there, a nearly invisible signal of what was coming, patient and certain, in the way that only things that had done this many times before could be certain. Dorothy looked at the window, at the light in the tree in the year preparing to turn again. She thought about the index card. For when everything else has failed, call this, they will come. They had come. She thought about the 78 men on a street in October, some of them sleeping now in the desert compound, 60 miles away, some of them in other places with their own lives and their own mornings. She thought about Dale Whitaker holding his hat in her doorway, about Daniel Hobart driving through the night, about Amy's voice in the room with the closed door telling a stranger the things she remembered in the order she remembered them, the most useful thing she knew how to do. She thought about Raymond at 22, standing beside a truck she had not known the history of, grinning at a camera, standing at the beginning of a thread he would spend the rest of his life maintaining. She stood up. She went to the refrigerator. She took out what she needed for dinner because there was a child at the table with homework, and a man sitting with a letter from his daughter, and dinner was the next thing that needed doing. That was all there was. The next thing. The showing up for it. The patient trust that the showing up would accumulate into something that mattered. It always did. It always had. Dorothy set the ingredients on the counter and began. Spring came to Harlow the way it always came, not announced but arrived, the temperature lifting a few degrees at a time until the accumulation was undeniable. The cottonwood leafed out, and the yard took on its green, and the mornings had a quality of warmth in them that the winter mornings had not. Dorothy planted tomatoes in the side bed, where Raymond had always planted them. Amy helped, or rather stood beside her, and asked questions about why tomatoes needed stakes, and whether seeds saved from one year's fruit would produce next year's plants, and whether the ones from the garden tasted different from the ones in the store. Dorothy answered each question precisely because Amy asked things in a way that expected real answers. It was the first spring Dorothy had planted the tomatoes with someone beside her since Raymond died. She noticed this without making more of it than it was. She was a practical woman about grief. She knew what it was and what it needed from her, and she gave it what it needed, which was mostly acknowledgement and occasionally the simple labor of doing the next thing. Amy was the next thing, in the best sense. Graves came by on a Saturday in late April, and the three of them sat on the porch in the warm afternoon, Dorothy with coffee, Amy with lemonade, Graves with coffee when Dorothy offered it. The street was ordinary. The cottonwood was full. A neighbor's dog went past with its owner and paused to assess the situation on the porch, and decided it required no comment and moved on. Amy was telling Graves about her school project. She had chosen a subject about a woman who had done something important that most people had not heard about, which Amy considered worth correcting. Graves listened with the full attention that she had come to expect from him, asked two questions, and Amy leaned slightly forward in her chair in the way she did when someone was meeting her at her level. Dorothy watched them and thought about what it meant to believe forward, to invest in a person before they had proven themselves worth the investment, simply because you had decided they were standing at the place where the road split and had not yet committed to failure. Raymond had believed forward his whole life. Dorothy had learned it from him, or rather, she had always had the instinct, and 39 years of marriage to Raymond had made it a discipline. Amy had it too. You could see it in the way she had walked next door on an October afternoon in long sleeves and trusted that the woman inside was worth trusting. In the way she had sat across from a stranger named Hobart and told the truth because Dorothy had said he was safe. in the way she had written to a 17-year-old girl she had never met and said, "Your father is someone who shows up." Children who had survived what Amy survived did not trust easily. When they trusted, it meant something. Dorothy was aware that she had been the recipient of something rare. She had been aware of it since the first afternoon, and she had tried to deserve it. She was still trying and expected to keep trying. The afternoon moved toward evening. The shadows lengthened across the yard, and the light went warm and amber, and the day made its patient way toward dark. Graves stayed for dinner. Dorothy made the pot roast that had been Raymond's particular weakness, the ones she made when she wanted to feed people properly. Amy set the table with the concentration she brought to things she had decided mattered, the forks in their correct positions, and the glasses filled before anyone asked. They ate together in the spring evening, and the conversation moved through the ordinary topics of people who had been through something and come out the other side and were now living the part that came after. After dinner, Amy went to her room to read, and Dorothy and Graves sat at the table with the quiet comfort of people who had learned to be in the same space without discomfort. Graves said, "After a while, I got another letter. From Sarah. She wants to meet," he said. She said she's been thinking about it since Amy wrote. She wants to meet before she turns 18, so it's her own choice and not something that happened by default. Dorothy said nothing for a moment. She let him have it. She said she wants Amy to come, Graves continued. She wants to meet Amy first. Dorothy thought about a 17-year-old who had spent her adolescence with a father sending letters that were intercepted, who had finally received 2 pages from an 8-year-old with no reason to lie, who had decided that was sufficient evidence to take a risk. "Believing forward," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "She learned it somewhere," Dorothy said. Graves was quiet. She watched him deciding whether to say the thing he was deciding whether to say. He said it. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "The ordinary father part. I know how to show up in a crisis. I know how to organize people and hold a line. I don't know how to just be someone's father on a Tuesday afternoon. The way Raymond was." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "Raymond didn't know either," she said. "Not at first. He figured it out one day at a time. He was wrong about things. He corrected himself and kept going. And that was enough." "It was more than enough," Dorothy said. "It was everything." Graves looked at his hands. The right one loose on the table, the left one still. "She might not want what I have to offer," he said. "She might not," Dorothy agreed. "But Amy says she does. And Amy is a camera. She doesn't misrepresent what she sees." He looked at the door to the hallway beyond which Amy was in her room with her rabbit and her book. "Okay," he said. The word of a man who had made a decision and was not going to qualify it. "Good," Dorothy said. She stood and cleared the plates. He helped without being asked. The kitchen settled into its nighttime order. Dorothy looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "He would have liked this evening," she said. "Not for any dramatic reason. The food and the company and the fact of people being fed." Graves followed her gaze. He was quiet. "I'll bring Sarah next month," he said, "if she's ready." "We'll make pot roast," Dorothy said. She turned off the stove light and left the small counter light burning, because Amy sometimes got up for water in the night, and it was better to have a light. Graves said goodnight and went out to his bike, and she stood on the porch and watched him go. The sound of the engine fading down Sycamore Road, and then gone, absorbed into the ordinary sounds of an April evening. She stood on the porch for a moment in the warm air. The cottonwood was fully leafed out and moving slightly in the evening breeze, and the street was quiet, and the town of Harlow was going about its nighttime business in its small, particular way. Dorothy breathed the spring air. The work was not done. It was never done. There would be more court appearances, more documentation, more of the long, patient building of things meant to last. There would be Amy's growing up, which would not be simple, and which would require the full measure of everything Dorothy had, and then some. There would be Sarah next month at this table. There would be, she suspected, other calls. Other numbers from other address books, other people standing at the split in the road who needed someone to stop the truck. Raymond had built that understanding into her without her quite realizing it was being built. She had absorbed it across 39 years of mornings. You saw the person in front of you, and you decided whether they needed something you could give. Usually the answer was yes. Dorothy went inside. She looked in on Amy, asleep with the rabbit beside her, and the star-shaped nightlight casting its small, steady points across the ceiling. Her face still and peaceful, in the way faces went when the body had decided it was safe enough to let go. Dorothy stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about the index card in Raymond's handwriting. The certainty with which he had written it, the specific faith of a man leaving instructions for a contingency he hoped would never arrive, and trusted would be handled correctly if it did. She had handled it correctly. She thought he would agree. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming the particular deep sleep of a body that had expended exactly what it had and been told it could stop for now. Outside, the April dark held everything in its patient grip, and the cottonwood stood full and rustling in whatever breeze found its way down Sycamore Road. In the next room, Amy slept. 60 miles away, men who had stood on a street in October slept in the desert or kept watch or lived the ordinary lives they had returned to after showing up when showing up was needed. The network did not dissolve when the immediate crisis was over. It simply redistributed, returned to its natural shape, available in the way that things built correctly were available when they were needed again. Dorothy slept. The stars kept their watch. The morning was coming as it always came, patient and certain, entirely indifferent to whether anyone was ready for it. They were ready. Amy's 9th birthday came in late spring on a day when the desert remembered how to be beautiful wildflowers opening across the vacant lot behind the house. The temperature sitting at the edge of warm, where it was comfortable to be outside without reason. Dorothy had been planning the party for 3 weeks, in the same methodical way she planned everything, working forward from what was needed to what needed to be done, and in what order. Graves came with Prophet and Ramirez and 2 others from the compound. Whitaker came with Barbara, who brought dahlias from her garden, which were not yet in full season, but she had coaxed a few early stems for the occasion. Earl Briggs drove up again, which Dorothy had not expected, and which she suspected she would stop not expecting soon, because Earl Briggs had apparently decided that occasions in Dorothy's kitchen were worth driving for. Hobart came with his wife. Dr. Renee Hobart came with a friend she had known 20 years. Naomi Briggs, Dorothy's nursing school classmate, and the woman who had connected her to the state attorney general's office, came from 2 hours away and sat at the far end of the table and told Amy stories about Dorothy at 22 that were both accurate and somewhat embarrassing. Amy sat at the head of the table in a spot that had not been anyone's particular spot and was now hers. She wore the expression of a person who has been given something they had stopped believing was available and is experiencing the specific, pleasant disorientation of that. The slight unreality of the good thing. She recovered from it by the time the cake arrived. She blew out her 9 candles with the focused intentionality of a child who understood that a wish was a commitment made to yourself and was not, therefore, to be made carelessly. Dorothy did not ask what she had wished for. After when most people had gone and the kitchen was being cleaned and Prophet was pretending he had not eaten 3 pieces of cake when he had eaten 4, and Amy was in the living room showing Ramirez the carburetor diagram she had been working on with Prophet, Amy came and stood beside Dorothy at the sink. She took the dish Dorothy handed her and dried it carefully and set it in the cabinet where it belonged. "Dorothy," she said. "Yes, I wished for something I think I might already have." Dorothy stopped washing. She turned to look at Amy. "What's that?" Amy turned the next dish in her hands before drying it the particular handling of someone who is thinking about something while doing something else. "People to call when everything else has failed," she said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "You heard me tell that story," she said. "I remember everything," Amy said simply. Dorothy looked at this child who had survived what she survived by paying attention and telling the truth and trusting the people who proved themselves worth trusting, who had lived as a camera holding images until they could be developed into something that helped. She thought about the index card, about Raymond's handwriting on it. "You already have it," Dorothy said. Amy nodded. She dried the next dish. They stood at the sink together in the late afternoon, and finished the dishes, and the sounds of the remaining people came through from the other rooms. Graves's low voice and Prophet's laugh, and Barbara Whitaker telling something animated that made Earl Briggs respond with the dry humor he kept in reserve for people he liked. Dorothy's hands were in warm water. Her kitchen was full. She was not done yet. There would be more of the long, patient work of building things that lasted. There would be Amy's therapy, and Amy's school, and Amy's gradual accumulation of the understanding of what a morning felt like when you did not have to calculate whether it was safe. There would be someday Sarah at this table. Dorothy finished the last cup. Amy dried it and put it back in the cabinet. Amy looked out the window at the afternoon. "Dorothy," she said, "when we go to meet Sarah, what should I say to her?" Dorothy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "What you observed," she said. "The same as always. You told her in the letter what you saw. When you meet her, you tell her whatever else you see. That's all she needs. Just what's true." Amy thought about this. "Then, what if she's nervous?" "She will be nervous," Dorothy said. "So will Graves. So might you." "What do I do?" "You do what you always do," Dorothy said. "You pay attention and you tell the truth, and you trust that the people in the room are trying to do the same. The rest takes care of itself." Amy dried the last dish and set it in the cabinet. "Okay," she said. The party continued into the evening. Fires were lit in the backyard, small, and contained the kind Raymond had made on autumn evenings when the air warranted it. Amy sat between Prophet and Ramirez on the back steps, and they told her things about motorcycles, and she told them things about engine compression ratios that she had learned from Prophet, testing the extent of what she had retained. And Prophet watched her with the satisfied expression of a man who had found a student who paid attention. Graves sat on the step below Dorothy, not beside her, just below, which felt like the right geometry for that moment, close but not equal, a position of presence that was its own statement. "Are you happy?" he asked. Dorothy considered the question with the same seriousness she considered all questions that deserved it. "Yes," she said. "Not the simple happiness of having what you always expected. The other kind. The kind that knows what it cost and what it's made of." He nodded. "Raymond would have sat exactly here," Dorothy said. "On this step, on this kind of evening. He would have had a beer and not said much and been aware of everything." Graves was quiet for a moment. "I think about him most days," he said. "So do I," Dorothy said. They sat on the steps in the spring evening, and the fires burned and the people talked. And Amy laughed at something Prophet said, a real laugh, unguarded and complete. The laugh of a child who had stopped keeping a percentage of herself in reserve. Dorothy listened to it. It was the sound of something being restored. Not to what it was that was not how restoration worked. To something new that incorporated what had been broken, that was stronger along the break lines, the way things were sometimes stronger there, the way scar tissue was denser than what it replaced. Amy was not who she would have been if none of this had happened. She was who she was, which included what she had been through. And what she had been through had made her exact in ways that would serve her for the rest of her life. Her attention, her precision, her willingness to trust carefully and then completely. Her camera memory, her instinct for what needed doing, and her simple commitment to doing it. All of this was hers. All of it would stay hers. Dorothy had not saved her from what had happened. Nobody could do that. What she had done was make sure it did not continue, and make sure Amy knew that it was not the permanent shape of her life, and be present for the long work of building what came after. That was all parenting ever was, Dorothy thought. Not protection from everything. Presence for what you could not protect from. She could do that. She was already doing it. The evening moved toward night, and the fires burned down to coals, and people began to say their good nights in the unhurried way of people who had been properly fed and properly together, and had no urgent reason to leave, but understood that nights ended. Prophet went last, pausing at the door to tell Amy that they had a carburetor waiting for her next Saturday, if she was still interested. Still interested, Amy confirmed. Then he was gone, and the house was quiet. Dorothy and Amy stood in the kitchen doing the last of the tidying. The ordinary machinery of the end of the day, cups rinsed and surfaces wiped, and the small, deliberate acts of returning things to their correct places. Amy said, "Dorothy, I'm glad you didn't accept the form letter." Dorothy looked at her. "I'm glad too," she said. Amy put the last cup in the cabinet and closed it. "I think my mom would be glad," she said. She believed things should be fixed when they were broken. "Your mother was right about that," Dorothy said. "She knew you were the kind of person who would try," Amy said. "That's why I knocked on your door that first afternoon. I saw the way you watched from your porch. I thought you were watching in a way that meant you were paying attention." Dorothy stood for a moment with the dish towel in her hands. "You were 8 years old," she said. "I was paying attention," Amy said simply. Dorothy looked at this 9-year-old who had walked next door on an October afternoon with long sleeves in warm weather because she had assessed the woman on the porch and determined that the assessment was worth the risk. All of it had started there, with a child deciding to trust her own reading of a situation and act on it. Raymond would have found that instructive, Dorothy thought, the lesson running in both directions. You had to be worth trusting before the people who needed to trust you could. She put the dish towel down. "Time for bed," she said. Amy went without argument, which was its own small miracle. She brushed her teeth and put on her pajamas and got into bed, and Dorothy sat on the edge of the mattress for a few minutes in the particular companionable quiet of the end of a day. "Good night," Dorothy said. Amy looked up at the ceiling where the nightlight was casting its star points. "Good night," she said. Then Dorothy, "I think it's going to be okay." Dorothy looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." She turned off the overhead light. The star points stayed. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the small, particular light of the room, the breathing of the child who had chosen this house, and this woman, in this life. Then she went down the hall to her own room. She sat on the edge of her own bed for a moment in the quiet house. She thought about the index card, about the phone call in the October morning, about 78 motorcycles on a street in the dark, about Amy's voice telling the truth to a stranger in a room with a closed door, about Dale Whitaker holding his hat, about the letter from Sarah that said, "I want to believe that." She thought about Raymond at the beginning of all of it, standing beside a truck at 22, knowing something that would take 30 years and more to fully work itself out. She lay down. She was 74 years old, and she had been a nurse for 31 years, and she had been married for 39 years, and she had been herself for all of it, and there was still more of it left, which she found without qualification to be good. The house was quiet. The spring night was warm. The cottonwood stood in the yard with its full leaf, patient and particular and entirely itself. Dorothy closed her eyes. She slept. The morning after Amy's birthday, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her first cup of coffee and worked through the week ahead the way she always worked through it, item by item, in the order of what needed doing and when. Therapy appointment Tuesday. School conference Thursday, the first one Dorothy would attend as Amy's legal guardian rather than as a concerned neighbor. A distinction that still settled into her in small, incremental ways. Each occasion of it a new acknowledgement of what had become permanent. Call Hobart's office to confirm the 6-month supervisory report had been received. Call Naomi about the state advocacy symposium she had been asked to speak at in September. She had been asked to speak about the process that had led to the Voss case, the documentation in the network, and the sequence of decisions. She had said she would think about it. She was thinking about it. She thought that perhaps the useful thing to speak about was not the crisis itself, but the infrastructure of it, the years of investment in knowing people and being known, and maintaining the connections that the ordinary pressure of living wore down, if you let it. Raymond had understood this. He had kept Christmas cards and phone numbers, and had paid forward across decades without knowing exactly what he was building toward. Only that the building mattered. There was something worth saying about that, about how the extraordinary moments were supported by the ordinary maintenance of everything that came before. She added the symposium to the notebook. Amy came downstairs at 7:30 in the particular way she came downstairs on school mornings, fully awake and already purposeful, her backpack slung on one shoulder, Her rabbit left upstairs in its customary position on the pillow, which was how Dorothy knew Amy was having a good morning. The rabbit's presence or absence on her arm functioned as a reliable indicator. She sat down at the table, and Dorothy poured her orange juice and started the eggs. "There's a new project starting Monday," Amy said. "We have to interview someone who changed something for the better and write about what they did." "Who are you going to interview?" Dorothy asked. "You," Amy said. "Obviously." Dorothy looked at her. "You change things for the better," Amy said. "That's what the project is about." Dorothy stood at the stove for a moment. "I'll tell you what I told Mr. Hobart at the courthouse," she said. "That changing things requires a great deal of help from a great many people. That no single person changes anything alone." "I know that," Amy said. "But you were the center of it. The rest of the people were because of you." She thought about this for a moment, like how a wheel works. All the spokes go out from the center. The center is what makes the spokes useful. Dorothy finished making the eggs and brought them to the table. She sat across from Amy in the morning light. She thought about Raymond stopping a truck on a dark road. She thought about a number on an index card. She thought about the 78 men on Sycamore Road in October, and Dale Whitaker holding his hat, and Daniel Hobart driving through the night, and Amy in the room with the closed door, telling the truth. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece. Two young men at the beginning of something. One of them, the grandfather of the man who had come, when she called the other the man she had chosen, and who had chosen her. She looked at Amy across the table. "You can write about the wheel," she said, "but make sure you include the spokes." Amy nodded. She ate her eggs. She was quiet in the focused way she was quiet when she was thinking something through. "Dorothy," she said. "Yes." "When you called the number, were you scared?" Dorothy considered this honestly. "No," she said. "I was angry and I was determined, and I believed it would work because Raymond had told me it would. Being scared would have required uncertainty." Amy thought about this. "Then I was scared. When I knocked on your door that first afternoon, I didn't know what you would do." "I know," Dorothy said, "but I knocked anyway." "You did." "My mom used to say that scared and brave weren't opposites," Amy said. "That brave was just what happened when you did the thing that scared you anyway. She said the people who were never scared were just the people who weren't paying attention." Dorothy looked at her. "Your mother was a wise woman," she said, "and you are her daughter." Amy looked at the table, then back up. "I think about her a lot," she said. "I know. You can tell me about her whenever you want to. I'd like to know who she was." Amy was quiet for a moment. "She made really good soup," she said finally. "Better than anyone else's soup. She put something in it that I never figured out what it was." Dorothy thought about Sandra Voss, 34 years old, making soup with a secret ingredient, not knowing what was coming, leaving behind a daughter who remembered everything, including the soup. "Tell me more about the soup," Dorothy said. Amy told her. She described it precisely, the color of it, and the smell, and the specific warmth of it in a bowl, the way her mother served it with crackers she kept in a particular cabinet, the way the steam came off it on cold evenings. She described it the way she described everything, with the camera precision that was her inheritance and her survival tool and her particular gift. Dorothy listened. This was also part of it, she thought. This was also the work. Sitting across a table from a child and making space for the people the child carried with her, the ones who were gone and the ones who were coming, giving them all room to be present, treating the dead with the respect of being remembered, and the future with the respect of being anticipated. She poured more orange juice. Outside, the May morning was warm and clear, and the cottonwood was full, and the street was quiet and ordinary in the way that streets were quiet and ordinary when they had been returned to themselves after something large had moved through them. Dorothy looked at the window. She looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. She looked at Amy across the table eating her eggs, describing soup, carrying her mother in her words, and her attention, and the precise way she described every true thing she had ever observed. One step to the next, Dorothy thought. That was all. That was the whole of it. That was always enough. She picked up her fork. The morning continued. In the weeks that followed Amy's birthday, the ordinary rhythm of their life on Sycamore Road established itself with the particular solidity of things that had found their correct shape. School days had their pattern. Weekends had theirs. Thursday afternoons, Graves came by, and twice a month, Amy went to the compound with Dorothy to work on whatever profit had waiting for her. And each time she came home with grease under her fingernails and the particular satisfaction of someone who had learned something that required both knowledge and hands. Dorothy noticed the way Amy talked about the compound and the men there, not with the wariness she brought to most new things, but with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had decided that this strange place and its strange inhabitants were simply part of the landscape of her life, to be navigated with the same attention she brought to everything else. She asked Prophet questions the way she asked Dorothy questions, directly expecting real answers, following up when the answer raised further questions. Prophet responded with the same precision she required. Dorothy had watched them together a half-dozen times now and thought that Amy had found in him something that was not a replacement for any specific relationship, but was its own category, the kind of adult who took you seriously as a student and expected you to earn the next lesson. Graves brought Sarah on a Saturday in June. Dorothy had made pot roast the day before and reheated it because pot roast was always better the second day, and this meal deserved the best version. She had set the table with the care she brought to things that mattered. 4 places, the cups in their positions. Sarah was 17 and had her father's eyes and her mother's wariness and her own considerable self-possession. The self-possession of a person who had spent years deciding what she thought about things before saying them. She stood in Dorothy's kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at the room and at Dorothy with the evaluating attention of someone who had been told something and was now determining whether what they had been told matched what they saw. Amy was at the kitchen table. She looked up at Sarah. "You look like him," Amy said, around the eyes. Sarah looked at her. Then she looked at Graves, who was standing slightly behind and to the side the way he always stood present without pressing. She said, "You pay attention to everything Sarah said to Amy." "I remember everything Amy said. I'm like a camera." Sarah considered this. Then she came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from Amy. Dorothy brought the pot roast. They ate. The conversation moved the way conversations moved when people were deciding whether to trust each other and were moving forward anyway because the alternative was remaining still, and remaining still had costs that all of them, in their different ways, had already paid. Sarah told Amy about her school. Amy told Sarah about the carburetor she had rebuilt. Graves ate and listened with the attention of a man receiving something he had been waiting for without quite letting himself believe it would arrive. Dorothy refilled cups and passed bread and was present in the way she had learned to be present in rooms where important things were being decided, which was quietly and without pressure, and with enough warmth that the room felt safe enough for the deciding. After dinner, Sarah helped Dorothy clear the plates without being asked, which Dorothy noted. At the door when they were leaving, Sarah stopped and looked at Dorothy. "Amy wrote me the truest letter I've ever gotten," she said. "She described my dad as someone who shows up. I've been thinking about that for months." Dorothy looked at her. "He shows up," Dorothy confirmed. "I've seen it. And the showing up for him is not a performance. It's what he actually is." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I think I knew that," she said. But it helped to hear it from someone who didn't have a reason to say it, except that it was true. "That's the only reason I ever say anything," Dorothy said. Sarah nodded. Then she went out to where Graves was waiting by the motorcycle in the June evening, and Dorothy stood in her doorway and watched them stand together in the long summer light, father and daughter, in the tentative beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to start. Amy stood beside Dorothy. "It's going to be okay," Amy said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "It is." They stood in the doorway and watched until the motorcycle turned at the end of Sycamore Road and was gone. Then they went inside. Dorothy washed the pot and Amy dried it, and they put it away in the cabinet where it lived. And the kitchen was clean, and the house was quiet in the specific way it was quiet on evenings when things had gone well. Dorothy looked at the mantelpiece, at the photograph, at the 2 young men in the truck in the beginning of everything. She thought about Raymond. She thought about him every day. She thought about him now with something that was not purely grief, but was the more complicated feeling of a person who has been trusted with something important and has tried to be worthy of it and believes with the particular certainty that comes from evidence that they have managed. The index card was still in the back of the address book on the shelf. She had not put it away. She did not intend to put it away. For when everything else has failed, call this, they will come. They had come. And in the coming, they had brought with them the proof of everything Raymond had understood about what people were at their best capable of. The proof that investment across years paid forward. The proof that broken things could be stood beside and carried and eventually slowly healed into something that incorporated the breaking without being defined by it. Dorothy turned off the kitchen light. She left the small counter light burning. She went down the hall, looked in on Amy, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the room that had been waiting to be someone's room and now was. Then she went to bed. The house settled around her, warm, in particular, and still becoming, as houses did when the right people were in them. Outside, the summer night held Sycamore Road in its patient grip, and the cottonwoods stood in the yard, and the stars kept their watch overhead, and everything that had been set in motion by a phone call on an October morning continued its forward movement as all things set in motion by love and patience and the simple decision to show up continued their movement. Long after the lights were out, long after the street was quiet, still always forward.